A 19-year-old stood accused of contempt. The judge mocked him, the audience laughed, until he dropped a legal bombshell that left the entire room speechless. The courtroom was packed. Tension buzzed in the air, a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment hanging over the heads of everyone seated on the wooden benches. Some were there for their own cases, others had just come to witness the latest courtroom spectacle, the kind of small-town drama that made its way into whispered conversations over coffee the next morning. At the front of the room, behind the imposing mahogany desk, Judge Richard Calloway adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowed at the young man standing before him. 19-year-old Xavier Monroe had his hands stuffed in the pockets of his oversized hoodie, the drawstrings swinging slightly as he rocked on his heels. His expression? Calm. Too calm. The judge wasn't a fan of that. "You have any idea where you are, son?" Calloway asked, his voice laced with that tired, self-important tone of a man who'd spent decades believing he'd seen it all. Xavier didn't flinch. Didn't shuffle awkwardly like most teenagers would when placed under the scrutiny of an entire courtroom. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was studying the judge just as much as he was being studied. "I do, Your Honor," he replied, clear, steady, no hesitation. But that only seemed to annoy Calloway further. He let out a sharp breath, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you think this is some kind of joke. Walking in here dressed like that, hands in your pockets, looking me in the eye like you don't have a care in the world. Let me remind you, you're in contempt of court. That's a serious charge. But I doubt you even know what that means." There it was, the first mistake. A ripple of chuckles spread across the courtroom. Someone in the back muttered something under their breath. A few heads shook, a couple of amused smirks forming. To them, this was entertainment. A teenage troublemaker getting put in his place by a judge who'd probably thrown the book at kids like him more times than he could count. Xavier didn't react. Didn't blink. Didn't break eye contact. Instead, he exhaled softly, his voice just loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "Contempt of court," he said. "Defined under 18 U.S. Code 401 as behavior that obstructs the administration of justice, disrespects judicial authority, or willfully disobeys a court order. It carries a potential penalty of up to 6 months in jail and a fine, but in non-criminal proceedings, the punishment is at the court's discretion." Silence. Not just from the judge, but from everyone. Judge Calloway leaned forward slightly, expression shifting, though he quickly masked it with a scoff. "Oh, so you've been doing some Googling. Congratulations." Xavier's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but something close. Not amusement. Confidence. "No, sir. I just know the law." But the judge wasn't ready for what was coming next. A few soft chuckles spread through the room, but this time they carried a different tone. It wasn't just amusement anymore. It was curiosity. Judge Calloway, however, wasn't impressed. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, a dry smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, you know the law, do you?" he said, voice dripping with condescension. "What, you watch a couple of courtroom dramas and suddenly think you're the next Thurgood Marshall?" Laughter erupted from the crowd, louder this time. Even the bailiff let out a short breath through his nose, the closest thing to a laugh he'd allow himself in uniform. Xavier didn't budge. He didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't drop his gaze to the floor, didn't do what everyone in that room expected him to do. Stammer, get flustered, look small in the face of a judge's authority. Instead, he let the noise settle before speaking. "No, Your Honor. I know the law because I've studied it." The way he said it, calm, matter-of-fact, unwavering, sent a slight ripple through the room. People shifted in their seats, curiosity piqued. Even Calloway faltered for half a second before scoffing. "Studied it?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Tell me something, kid. If you're such an expert, why are you standing in my courtroom charged with contempt instead of sitting at counsel's table where the real attorneys are?" That one landed. The courtroom chuckled again, people exchanging amused glances. Xavier took a slow breath. "I was standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves," he said simply. Calloway let out a dry laugh. "Oh, well, aren't you a saint? And what exactly did you do that was so noble?" Xavier's fingers curled slightly in his hoodie pocket. He didn't look away. "I pointed out that a public defender failed to file a necessary motion, one that could have changed the entire course of his client's case. When I tried to explain, the bailiff removed me from the courtroom, and I was charged with contempt." A murmur spread through the crowd. People were listening now. But Calloway wasn't backing down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, amusement still flickering in his eyes. "So, let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You, some kid off the street, think you know the law better than a trained public defender?" Xavier's jaw tensed slightly, but when he spoke, his voice was measured. "I think," he said, "that a public defender with 40 open cases and no time to breathe isn't in the best position to fight for every client the way they deserve." That shut the room up. Even Calloway's smirk flickered. For the first time, the laughter had stopped. But Xavier wasn't done proving his point. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. It wasn't the awkward kind, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably or clear their throats just to break the tension. This was different. This was the silence of people realizing that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the joke they thought it was. Judge Calloway, however, wasn't ready to backpedal just yet. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression still laced with skepticism. "So that's your defense," he said. "That you, a 19-year-old with no formal legal education, somehow caught something a trained attorney missed?" Xavier exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the room pressing down on him, waiting, testing. "Yes," he said simply. A scoff. "All right then, genius," Calloway said, waving a hand. "Go on, impress us. What motion are you talking about?" Xavier shifted his weight slightly, still casual, but his voice sharpened just a fraction. The voice of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. "A motion to suppress evidence under the Fourth Amendment," he said. "The search that led to the defendant's arrest was unconstitutional. The arresting officers didn't have probable cause, nor did they have a warrant, and no exceptions applied. The contraband found in his vehicle should have been inadmissible in court." Another ripple moved through the audience. A few people leaned in. Even the public defender in question, who had been sitting off to the side, trying to blend in, visibly stiffened. Judge Calloway squinted at him. "You expect me to believe that you just... what? Read the Fourth Amendment in your spare time and figured that out?" Xavier let a small breath of amusement slip, the first sign of anything close to a smile since he stepped in the courtroom. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I read the case law." Calloway's brow lifted slightly, but Xavier was already continuing. "Map v. Ohio, 367 U.S., 643, 1961, he said, voice steady. "Evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment is inadmissible in state courts. Arizona v. Gant, 556 U.S. 332, 2009, further establishes that a warrantless vehicle search is only justified if the arrestee is within reaching distance of the vehicle at the time of the search, or if the police have reason to believe the vehicle contains evidence related to the offense of arrest. Neither applied in this case." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. This time, they weren't mocking. Judge Calloway's smirk was gone. Xavier continued, his voice unwavering. "If the public defender had filed a motion to suppress based on these precedents, the evidence would have been thrown out. No evidence, no case. Instead, his client is sitting in a holding cell right now, about to take a plea deal that'll ruin his record, all because no one had the time or the interest to fight for him." A beat of silence. Then, from the back of the room, a voice muttered, "Damn." Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Xavier caught it. The shift of a man who had just realized he was losing control of the room. "All right, kid," Calloway said, voice gruffer now. "You made your point. But last I checked, this isn't a law school classroom. You were removed from the courtroom for being disruptive, not for giving a lecture on constitutional rights." Xavier tilted his head slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, voice even. "How is it disruptive to point out when justice is being overlooked?" The room went dead silent. Even Calloway had no immediate response. But he was quickly realizing this was no ordinary teenager. Judge Calloway shifted in his seat, a flicker of discomfort passing over his face. He was used to controlling his courtroom, used to people shrinking under his authority. But this was new. He exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers against the bench. "All right, fine. You're clearly well read. But knowing case law and practicing law are two different things. You're not an attorney, you're a—" He stopped himself. Because for the first time since Xavier stepped into the courtroom, he wasn't sure what to call him. A troublemaker? No, troublemakers didn't cite legal precedents off the top of their heads. A wannabe? No, wannabes didn't have a deep enough understanding to catch mistakes that actual lawyers missed. Xavier watched him, waiting. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just waited. Calloway cleared his throat. "You still haven't explained something," he said, straightening his shoulders. "If you know so much, why didn't the defense attorney catch it? Why didn't the judge overseeing the case catch it?" Xavier didn't hesitate. They were moving too fast. Calloway frowned. "Excuse me." Xavier took his hands out of his hoodie pockets and gestured, not in a frantic way, not in a disrespectful way, just enough to make his point clear. Public defenders are overworked, judges are overloaded. The system isn't built for scrutiny, it's built for efficiency. The goal isn't justice, it's closing cases. And when you prioritize speed over accuracy, mistakes happen. Calloway scoffed. "So you're saying you think you can do it better?" Xavier's voice was quiet, but strong. "I think I already did." That landed. Hard. A hushed murmur swept through the courtroom again, but this time the judge wasn't in control anymore. Xavier was. Even the public defender from the case looked away, his face tight. He knew Xavier was right. Everyone did. But no one wanted to say it. No one wanted to admit that a 19-year-old with no law degree had just exposed a fundamental flaw in the system. Judge Calloway's jaw tightened. He glanced at the bailiff, then at the court reporter, then back at Xavier. His usual methods weren't working. The condescension, the authority, the sarcasm, none of it had shaken the kid. So he tried something else. He folded his hands on the bench and said, "All right, you've made your case. But tell me, Xavier, what's your end game? You trying to be a lawyer?" Xavier's shoulders relaxed slightly. Not because he was intimidated, because he knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. "I don't need to try," he said. "I already am." The courtroom froze. Judge Calloway's brow furrowed. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Xavier took a step forward, not aggressively, not cocky, just enough to make sure everyone could hear him. "It means I've been working on cases for the past 2 years. It means I've filed motions under licensed attorneys. It means I've spent more hours in legal libraries than most students in law school. It means I'm taking the bar exam early." Calloway's expression cracked. It was only for a second, but Xavier saw it. The moment of realization. Xavier wasn't some punk kid who thought he knew everything. He actually did. And that changed everything. The courtroom felt different now. The energy had shifted. No more laughter, no more eye rolls. just silent, undivided attention. Judge Calloway's jaw twitched, his fingers pressing into the wood of his bench. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost careful. Xavier nodded once. "I don't expect anything. I'm just telling you the truth." Calloway exhaled sharply, glancing toward the bailiff. "Get me his file," he muttered under his breath. The bailiff hurried off, but Xavier was already speaking again. "You can check whatever records you want. You won't find a law school enrollment under my name because I never went. But that doesn't mean I didn't learn." Calloway folded his arms, studying him. "So how'd you do it then? You wake up one day and decide to memorize the legal code?" Xavier shook his head. "I didn't wake up one day, I woke up every day." A beat. Then for the first time he started talking about his past. "My mum worked 2 jobs, he said. "Most days I barely saw her. She got home late, left early. My older brother was supposed to watch me, but he got caught up with the wrong people. When he got arrested, they told him to take a plea deal, said it was his best option. He did. Ended up with a record that followed him everywhere." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I didn't get it at first," Xavier continued. "I thought the system was supposed to be fair. I thought the judge, the lawyer, everyone was supposed to care. But I learned fast." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "They didn't. Not really." Judge Calloway's expression was unreadable now. Xavier let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "My brother was never the same after that," he said, "and I hated it. I hated knowing that if someone had just fought for him the way they were supposed to, his life could have been different." Another pause. "So I started reading. I went to the library, picked up old law textbooks, case law, whatever I could find. At first it was just about understanding what happened to him. But the more I read, the more I realized. It wasn't just him. It was everywhere." Calloway's fingers tapped against the desk again, but not impatiently this time. Thoughtfully. "You're saying you did all this on your own?" Xavier hesitated for the first time. Then finally he shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I had a mentor." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Who?" A voice rang out from the back. "That would be me." All heads turned as Elliot Graves stepped forward, a well-known civil rights attorney. Gasps spread through the room. Even Calloway looked caught off guard. Graves walked up the aisle, his sharp suit cutting through the sea of stunned faces. When he reached the front, he placed a firm hand on Xavier's shoulder. "It's true," Graves said. "I met Xavier when he was 16. He asked me a legal question, and when I answered, he came back the next day with follow-up questions I wouldn't expect from most law students." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I knew right then that he wasn't normal." Xavier looked down, almost embarrassed. "I took him under my wing," Graves continued. "I let him sit in on cases, taught him how to research, how to write motions. And you know what?" He turned to Calloway. "Half the time he caught things that even I missed." The murmurs grew louder. Calloway exhaled, rubbing his forehead. This was spiraling into something much bigger than he had expected. He looked at Xavier again, his gaze unreadable. "You really plan on taking the bar?" Xavier nodded. "Next year." Calloway let out a dry breath. He wasn't laughing anymore, because for the first time he understood exactly who he was dealing with. The courtroom was no longer just an audience. It was an arena of realization. Whispered conversations rippled through the benches, people exchanging glances, some with skepticism, others with something closer to respect. Judge Calloway wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to a room that followed his lead, a narrative he dictated. But now, all eyes were on Xavier. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench before he sighed, rubbing his temple. He wasn't about to admit it, but Xavier had backed him into a corner. He leaned forward. "All right," he said, voice level. You've made it clear you're intelligent, that you've studied, that you know your way around a courtroom. Xavier stayed silent, waiting. But what you haven't made clear, Calloway continued, his tone hardening just slightly, grasping for any remaining authority he had left, is why you think that gives you the right to disrupt legal proceedings. Law isn't a game, kid. Knowing the rules doesn't mean you get to break them whenever you feel like it. Xavier met his gaze unwavering. I wasn't breaking them. I was defending them. A sharp murmur swept through the crowd. Calloway exhaled. Is that what you tell yourself? Xavier didn't hesitate. It's what I tell the people who don't have anyone else fighting for them. That landed, hard, and Calloway felt it. For the first time since this all started, he didn't have a quick response. The weight of Xavier's words hung in the air, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Even the public defender from the case looked visibly unsettled now. Judge Calloway shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the wood. He didn't like this. He didn't like feeling like the one under scrutiny, like the roles had somehow reversed. But that's exactly what had happened. He glanced toward the prosecution table, where the assistant district attorney sat stiffly, trying his best to appear uninterested. Then he looked back at Xavier. Finally, he sighed. A slow, heavy exhale. All right, he said. Let's say for a second that I believe everything you've said, that you're serious about this, that you're not just some kid playing legal vigilante. He paused. That still doesn't change the fact that you were charged with contempt of court. And last I checked, the law applies to everyone, even the people who think they know it best. A murmur rippled through the crowd again, but Xavier didn't blink. Then apply it fairly, he said. Calloway narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? If you're going to charge me with contempt, Xavier said, his voice steady, then you should charge every attorney who ignores their client's rights, every prosecutor who buries evidence, every judge who rushes a case without fully reviewing it. The room went dead silent, because he wasn't wrong. Calloway's jaw tightened. Xavier took a step forward, not aggressive, just firm. You want me to respect this court? He asked. Then show me that it deserves respect. Another heavy silence, and for the first time in Judge Calloway's long career, he wasn't sure what to say. The weight of Xavier's words settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. It was rare to see a judge at a loss for words, rarer still to see one being challenged in his own domain. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, not as a warning, but as a way to ground himself. You're walking a fine line here, son, he muttered. Xavier didn't flinch. I know. The judge leaned back, rubbing his forehead. He had a decision to make. He could throw the book at Xavier, make an example out of him, show the courtroom that authority wasn't to be questioned. Or he could acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the kid had a point. The room was waiting. Calloway's eyes flicked toward Elliot Graves, the well-respected civil rights attorney still standing beside Xavier. Graves didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to remind Calloway that this wasn't just about a teenager with too much confidence. This was about something bigger. Calloway took a deep breath, then finally sat forward. Xavier Monroe, he said, his voice firm, but no longer laced with condescension. You were charged with contempt of court for interrupting legal proceedings. A pause. Xavier held his breath. Calloway let his gaze sweep over the room before exhaling. Charge dismissed. A wave of reactions rippled through the courtroom. Some people gasped, others murmured in disbelief. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. But Calloway wasn't finished. However, he continued, locking eyes with Xavier, I strongly suggest you find a way to put that knowledge to use within the system, rather than against it. Xavier didn't react at first. He just stood there, processing the words, the reality of what just happened. Then, slowly, he nodded. The judge tapped his gavel once. Court is adjourned. With that, the courtroom erupted. People whispered, shook their heads, nudged each other, some in shock, some in admiration. A few reporters in the back scrambled to take notes, already preparing their headlines. But Xavier didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he turned to Graves, who was watching him with a small, knowing smile. "You knew that would happen, didn't you?" Xavier muttered. Graves chuckled, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "I knew you'd make them listen," he said, and that was enough. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people, lawyers, law students, even a couple of strangers, approached Xavier, shaking his hand, asking him questions. People who, just an hour ago, had dismissed him as nothing more than a reckless teenager. Judge Calloway watched from the bench, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he stood up and walked away. Xavier exhaled deeply, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets as he turned to Graves. "So what now?" he asked. Graves smiled. Now you prove them all wrong. The system wasn't built to recognize people like Xavier, but that didn't mean it couldn't be changed. Because sometimes all it takes is one person, one voice unwilling to back down, one mind sharp enough to expose the cracks, one heart determined enough to push forward no matter the resistance. Xavier Monroe wasn't just some kid with a rebellious streak. He was the future. And whether the system liked it or not, he was here to stay. How many times have people been dismissed because of their age, background, or appearance, even when they had something valuable to say? How many mistakes have gone unchecked because no one bothered to question them? The next time you see someone standing up for what's right, ask yourself, are you listening? Because change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people refuse to stay silent, and that is how justice is made.